So it's not that this kind of way of looking at the world is automatically wrong, but that it's the one-sidedness that tends to skew things. Welcome back to Mind Matters. I'm Harrison Cayley, joined by Ilan Martin, Adam Daniels, and joining us again, Lucien Koch. We are going to get into today's show, as a segue from last week's show, I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from McGilchirst's book, The Matter with Things. And then we'll get into something that McGilchirst calls the Schizo-autistic philosophical style. And that is related, we will argue, I think, to what Andrew Lobaczewski calls the schizoidal worldview in political ponerology. So we'll be making some connections between the two and digging into that. So without further ado, McGilchirst writes, though I confess a lifelong addiction to it, that is to the kind of rational thinking, left-brain thinking of philosophy, like hard thinking. There is a sense in which philosophy, in general, is in itself an unhealthy activity. The disease, perhaps, as Karl Kraus said of psychoanalysis, for which it purports to be the cure. Jung wrote, for all its critical analysis, philosophy has not yet managed to root out its psychopaths. Philosophy still has to learn that it is made by human beings and depends to an alarming degree on their psychic constitution. In the critical philosophy of the future, there will be a chapter on the psychopathology of philosophy. I'll skip a bit more of that quote, then McGilchirst writes, indeed, and the point here is not just that philosophy is reflective of any old psychopathology that just happens on an individual basis to be present, but that a certain kind of unusual mind is preferentially and systematically attracted to philosophy of the analytic kind. This is a mind somewhere down the schizo-autistic spectrum, as many examples of now famous philosophers in the analytic tradition attest. For a philosopher such as Collingwood, imagination and empathy, the appreciation of context, both personal and historical, as well as the ability to feel your way into another's mind, all skills that are highly right hemisphere dependent, play a crucial role in understanding. Quote, unlike philosophers in the Ryle mold, end quote. Now, the footnote for that is to Monk 2019, which is I believe, the article that we quoted last week on Collingwood, Collingwood's early death and his how philosophy would have been different if he had lived and hadn't been replaced by Gilbert Ryle. So in this footnote, McGilchirst writes, he points to the narrowness, Monk does, he points to the narrowness, pugnacity, and cut and dried style of what I call the AAA Anglo-American analytic tradition, headed up by Gilbert Ryle. Its repudiation of context and neglect of the broader humanities, and wonders what would have happened if the broadly based, humane style of Collingwood, Ryle's predecessor, in the Waynflete chair at Oxford, had been allowed to flourish. And then he's got a quote from Monk. So I just wanted to make that connection from Collingwood to our present subject. We kind of hinted at it last week, I think. But that's what I want to get into, is this philosophers in the Ryle mold. McGilchirst continues, philosophers in the Ryle mold are more likely to take things out of context, think in disembodied schemata, and adopt irrationally rationalistic approaches. They tend toward utilitarianism in ethics, an approach that is also characteristic of people with frontal lobe damage, especially in the right hemisphere, the clinical picture of which resembles some types of autism. Which is not to say, of course, that all utilitarian philosophers are autistic, or that psychopathology makes the perceptions of its sufferers invalid. It may actually make some things easier to see, while hiding or distorting others. But it does invite the question why we should attach particular importance to a way of looking at the world which is typical of a spectrum of conditions which normally lead to their holders receiving treatment for a distressing illness. So before I comment on that, I want to read now some excerpts from Political Ponerology. As a bit of a summary, he calls it the schizo, McGilchirst calls it the schizo-autistic philosophical style or outlook. And he's referencing the kind of constellation of traits that are common to schizophrenics, schizoid personality disorder, schizoaffective disorders in general. And Lobaczewski talks about specifically about schizoid personality disorder, or as he calls it, schizoid psychopathy. And so on that, he writes, these are just a few excerpts. The common features of the varieties of this anomaly, or the common feature, is a dull pallor of emotion and weakness of the feeling for psychological realities and situations, the essential component of basic or emotional intelligence. Low emotional pressure enables them to develop efficient speculative reasoning, a kind of objectivity which is useful in non-humanistic spheres of activity, like economics, or for exploiting the emotionalism of others. However, their one-sidedness makes them prone to consider themselves intellectually superior to ordinary people, who, in their opinion, are mainly guided by their emotions. Carriers of this anomaly are hypersensitive and distrustful, but pay little attention to the feelings of others. They tend to assume extreme moralizing positions and are eager to retaliate for minor offenses. Sometimes they are eccentric and odd. Their poor sense of psychological situations and reality leads them to superimpose erroneous, pejorative interpretations upon others' intentions. They easily become involved in activities which are ostensibly moral, but which actually inflict damage upon themselves and others. Their impoverished psychological worldview makes them typically pessimistic regarding human nature. We frequently find expressions of their characteristic attitudes in their statements and writings. Quote, "Human nature is so bad that order in human society can only be maintained by a strong power created by exceptionally rational minds in the name of some higher idea. Let us call this typical expression the schizoidal declaration." A couple other quotes. "Human nature does in fact tend to be no good, especially when the schizoids embitter other people's lives as a result of their shortcomings, that is, or when schizoidal women are abandoned to loneliness." One more. "During stable times which are ostensibly happy, albeit marked by injustice to individuals and nations, doctrinaire people believe they have found a simple solution to fix such a world. Such a historical period is always characterized by an impoverished psychological worldview, so that a schizoidal worldview does not stand out as odd, and is accepted as legal tender. These doctrinaire individuals characteristically manifest a certain contempt with regard to moralists when preaching the need to rediscover lost human values and moral discipline, and to develop a richer, more appropriate psychological worldview." So those are just a few quotes from Ponerology. Right away, I'll just make a few little comments on them. First, you can see a lot of, while he's not speaking specifically in reference to philosophy, you can see a lot of philosophy in there. So the tendency to assume extreme positions, the kind of blocking off or bracketing off of morality and of the kind of more humanistic elements in philosophy, and McGilchirst and Monk talk about that in relation to the contrast between Collingwood and Ryle. And then there's a little hint in there to perhaps what might be a fruitful study of feminism in that comment about schizoidal women. Maybe we can get into that at some point. And so there's that disdain for the disdain for moralists, the exceptional kind of speculative reasoning. And at other points, at some other point in the book, I don't have the quote with me, Lobaczewski does point out that, oftentimes for the people that come up with like grand ideologies, and a lot of ideologies are created by, like Lobaczewski would argue, by schizoids, it's not that they're necessarily wrong. They will have good observations. They will either be addressing real issues or make some good observations. And McGilchirst makes the same point. So it's not that that this kind of way of looking at the world is automatically wrong, but that it's the one-sidedness that tends to skew things. So the one-sidedness that it's this black and white mentality that it's either this or that, and that will and does lead to some pretty extreme consequences, as we see, for example, with Marxism, where in that case, a political philosophy has baked into it a certain features, certain core presuppositions that, by virtue of those core presuppositions, make it play out in such a way. So this is why, for example, communism never works. It's because the philosophy is flawed from the very beginning, and deeply flawed. Lobaczewski argues is that the core reason for that isn't necessarily anything economic or philosophical in that sense. It's that it is at its root psychologically deficient. It has a misunderstanding of human nature. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's necessarily completely wrong about human nature, but it's limited in whatever statements it might make about human nature, which in essence kind of does make it wrong because it ignores so much else. But when we look at that view of humanity, for Lobaczewski, it's kind of a focus on the negative of humanity. There's this distrust for human nature and this kind of cynical, just negative view. So it's like the tendency would be to see all the flaws of humanity, but none of the actual good things or none of the positive bits, and that can influence how a political philosophy plays itself out. So, for instance, the schizoidal declaration that I just read, human nature is so bad that, well, human nature can be bad. That no one really denies that, and Lobaczewski wouldn't either. I mean, pretty much the whole point of Ponerology is all of the flaws within humanity and the flaws inherent in these certain types of pathology that create evil. But it's the balance that needs to be struck. So those are just some opening points that I wanted to make about that. I'll get into some more of what McGilchirst says, which has some examples. One that I'd known before, but I hadn't made the connection. But I'll save that for a few minutes. Unless, do you guys have anything to respond to those opening quotations?
Well, I think we benefit a little bit by fleshing out the term impoverished psychological worldview as opposed to a richer psychological worldview, because part of, I think, what an impoverished psychological worldview does is it not only negates, but it completely invalidates another perspective on the greater psychological reality of society. And in order to do that, it instills an emotional kind of fervor, a demonization, an attack, which kind of impels the person who is being influenced by a particular culturally Marxist ideology to deny any kind of value to what that other worldview that might be healthier and more constructive in some sense, but also just kind of exists as a matter of course as part of a spectrum of worldviews. And it makes for not only just a kind of limited interaction with the world, but it almost seeks to, on some level, destroy anything that isn't it. There was a line that speaks to this. I think you read it, Harrison. I had it notated for myself here. These doctrinaire individuals characteristically manifest a certain contempt with regard to moralists, then preaching the need to rediscover lost human values and to develop a richer, more appropriate psychological worldview. And when I read that, I thought about people like Jordan Peterson in particular, but also others who are attempting to be heard and understood, and who do have a psychologically healthier worldview that acknowledges both ends of the political spectrum, of the value spectrum, and who are also trying to draw upon traditional values and morals that have been the basis for stable societies for millennia, as far as they can tell, and are attempting to reintroduce these ideas in a way that is accessible, constructive, and makes sense and gives meaning to a segment of society that has found that they're missing something, that they're thirsting and hungry for some bit of knowledge that's been progressively, no pun intended, withdrawn from their perception, from their thinking, from their emotional life, from their psychology. So we are seeing this play out in real time. Voices like Peterson are attacked vehemently. And there are many others who are simply not allowed to offer an alternative perspective to the culturally Marxist points of view that we're seeing in society today, without being hounded and canceled and vilified. And it's happened so many times now that it just makes Lobaczewski's material, I think, its explanatory power is incredible. It is, this is someone who's obviously thought very deeply, based on his own experiences in Poland, about what he saw, and he drilled down into these ideas so much that we can read this text and we can nod our heads in recognition of the fact that it applies so accurately to the types of developments we're seeing right now. So those are my kind of 2 points to that.
Well, with Peterson, one thing that he discusses is, not to let things stay hidden. You have to talk about things. It's the stuff that you don't talk about that becomes an issue, that becomes a problem. It's when you don't talk about things that, then turn into the dragon, right? That destroys your life because you're not talking about it. And so if you take that as a way forward, as a way to live in the world, which is to talk about things, even the things that you find uncomfortable or distasteful, you have to air these things out, lest they grow in the darkness and become a dragon. That is a much healthier way of going about living your life personally and also politically. It's the reason why you have revolutionaries is because there's some group of people who have some issue which is not being addressed at large. And so then when they feel they have no outlet, no means by which they can voice their concern, their opinion, their struggle, when they're pushed into the fringe, into the closet, where they can fester and grow and become, violently revolutionary because they think they have no other means of recourse. Well, then, that's what creates a bunch of problems. And so take that and contrast it with, this schizotypal, autistic type personality who says anyone who sees things differently to me is wrong. Full stop. Anyone who sees things differently than me, basically is my enemy, or, is of little value because they see things using their emotions and I see things, using purely my intellect, or, whatever it is. That is just antithetical to, having something that's a more healthy dynamic. And so in a sense, like, it creates its own problems. They say that this simple solution will free us and create utopia, but really they're just creating the situations that are going to cause even more problems by virtue of the fact that they don't realize that it's not so black and white. It's not everyone who sees things differently is wrong. It's everyone who sees things differently has a different perspective. And that needs to be taken into account. It needs to be taken into consideration. And when you don't do that, that's what leads to problems. So it's just, that's kind of like my 2 cents on that in terms of Jordan Peterson and a richer worldview versus a more black and white, rigid and narrow worldview, and the issues that can, come out of that.
One of the main points that stands out for me is that, well, it can be, I guess, for new listeners that aren't kind of immersed into this material already, it might not seem obvious, or not seem as obvious as it might seem to us, like what we're talking about, and I think the reason for that is just how prevalent these worldviews are, that they influence the way probably most people on the planet think, because these ideas have been so influential over the past 100, 200 years, in various forms or more. Well, definitely more. We'll see some of the examples that I'll bring up. But you can see this kind of attitude. It's ubiquitous. You can see numerous examples of finding this problem and then looking for the solution and saying, "Oh, here's the solution." So you can find ideologies that are kind of either linked with that idea, with that problem, that solution, or which accommodate them. So you can have like climate change, for instance. Oh, we just have to focus on climate change. Or racism. Racism is the biggest problem. We just have to focus on racism. You find all of these kind of issues, this one issue that then becomes this kind of like monolithic issue that then needs to be addressed, as opposed to one spoke of a many spoked wheel that it interacts with numerous other problems. When you just isolate them and then come up with an ideology or a policy that tackles that problem, it's never going to work, because that's not the way issues work. Issues are never just this one singular thing that you can approach and solve. They're always going to be interconnected with numerous other things. And you can see this in like a Klaus Schwab, or a lot of the, historically, if you look back at the the capitalist socialists, like Michael Rechtenwald likes to bring up the example of what's his name, Gillette. So there's this Gillette guy, an innovator, a guy who came up with a good invention. I can't remember if it was actually him or maybe his son, but I'll just pretend it was him. Came up with the Gillette razor, right? And we have them today. But he was this utopian that thought that, the solution to all our problems is just to create one giant monopoly. And if we just have one giant monopoly, then that corporation can create or produce everything for everyone, and it'll be a utopia. And so this like simplistic idea just gets locked into his mind, and then he goes with it. And he was like a devotee of his own religion for however many years, an evangelist for his corporatist, monopolist, socialist utopia. And of course, unaware that the idea was bunk and just wouldn't work for numerous reasons, but fervent in his belief that it would work. And I think that's one of the allures of a political ideology created with this kind of mindset, is that, the problem exists because people will have personal experiences that will predispose them to value that issue and value finding a solution to it. And when you find a confident person who says, here's the problem, yes, I agree with you, and here's the solution, look how easy it is, it's like, oh, thank God, I can have hope because the problem can be solved. And then you get a whole bunch of converts that will support a wider social cause in a bigger social movement that kind of can go nowhere, but it ends up going somewhere, just not generally the direction that people would like. That's why it's a sad fact of history, and will continue to be into the future, where you look at all of the old communists, all the people in Eastern Europe and Russia who were gung ho, like working, or if not working class, then supporters of the working class, right? Who were fervent communists, who are the ones who ended up, getting purged, sent to the gulag, executed, not getting anything they wanted. And then those are the guys that said, oh, well, this isn't real communism. Because they had a point. It wasn't what they wanted, obviously. And the same thing happens repeatedly and will happen again. So my kind of future speculative scenario, you have the woke social justice types, maybe like put in CRT, like critical race theory in there, where in the future, if they get what they want, they'll be the ones saying, this isn't real social justice. This isn't real anti-racism, but there's not going to be anything they can do about it because, they were used and abused and thrown aside when they were no longer useful. It's because that's the only thing they end up actually being useful for, is putting someone else in power who just wants to use their ideology for that means. Now that's a specific example because it is wider than that. It's not just or at least in this episode, I don't want to just focus on political ideologies that go wrong and the reason for them or who creates them or whatever, because it is a much wider thing. It's not just political ideologies. It's the entire Western worldview to a certain degree that is infected or what's a better word? Tainted or just affected by warped. Yeah, exactly. And this goes back, and I think the reason is because, like McGilchirst points out, is that there's a certain type of person that tends to get into philosophy of this sort, right? Or to the great thinkers who then write great books, who then are read by multitudes of people who don't really share the same mentality, obviously, because they're not philosophers. It's not just philosophers that read other philosophers either, but probably today that's more true than not. But those ideas then filter down. And so that's why even though probably very few people in the English-speaking world have read any books that form the foundation of a scientific materialist worldview, did I say everything I want to say? That even though none of them have probably read any of those foundational books, they still have that mentality. Well, how did that happen? Well, it has to, that's the way ideas work. They spread, they filter around, they become the dominant zeitgeist or worldview of a culture, of an epoch, and people think in those terms. Like we were talking about last week, it kind of forms the absolute presuppositions of that epoch, of that time and that place, where people tend to think in those terms. And where do those terms come from? Well, I'll read just a short little thing here on this philosophical style. So McGilchirst writes, "Here I might make an aside on the philosophical personality. If I am right, as I argued in chapter 9, that schizo-autistic features suggest a tendency to left hemisphere modes of apprehension of the world, and depressive features suggest the opposite, one would expect highly analytic philosophers to have character features suggesting they are on the schizo-autistic spectrum. Descartes had many hallmarks of the schizoid personality. Spinoza and Kant were probably on the autistic spectrum, and so clearly was Bentham. In modern times, there is a case that Bertrand Russell, A.J. Ayer, and Derek Parfit also were, to name a few. Similarly, we might expect philosophers who were opposed to the analytic tradition to be more prone to depression. It is arguable that Pascal, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Emerson, C.S. Peirce, William James, and John Dewey were. Then he talks about Wittgenstein as an intriguing case because he showed both analytic trends and depressive trends in his personality. And he, but the one thing I wanted to, this last on this point, I wanted to say something about Descartes. This was who I was referring to earlier as something I'd been aware of beforehand, but hadn't made the connection. Later on, he writes, Descartes displays an essential schizoid personality. He was an example of both extreme left hemisphere credulity, and then in brackets he writes, animals are merely machines and feel no pain, despite their cries when dissected, and left hemisphere skepticism. I have no continuity of existence. Other people may be simply automata. Now, so this is something that I'd read years ago about Descartes and being a vivisectionist. Like, so he'd dissect animals while alive, but he kind of justified it to himself by the belief that they were just machines. So when they would cry and scream, there was no actual feeling or emotion behind it. That was just the programmed response of a robot, essentially, a machine. And you see, there was a similar trend among doctors, for instance, that believed that babies couldn't feel any pain. So they'd do like surgery on babies, newborns, without any anesthetic or anything, just because they believed that babies couldn't feel pain, despite the cries and the screams. And then that left hemisphere skepticism, like there is this tendency in a lot of philosophers to take seriously ideas that just seem like cracked or like off the rails. And a recent example is this guy. He was in the news. What's his name? This philosopher. Can't remember his name, but there was a recent controversy because a bunch of his published papers and public statements, like on podcasts, came up where he's giving a defense of like pedophilia, where he says it's not obvious to me why sex with a child is wrong. And then people came out to defend him, saying, "Oh, this is just what philosophers do. You know, they play devil's advocate and they take an opposite position." Mm-hmm. And it's like, yeah, to a degree, but at what point is someone just like screwed up in the head to where you can see that irrational rationalism? Well, okay, as a professional philosopher, let me look at this idea. Well, after thinking through it, very rationally, I come to the conclusion that I can't see any good reason why having sex with a newborn is a bad thing. And it's like, so there are actual philosophers like that, and then the people that defend them saying, "Oh, well, that's just what philosophers do." It's like, okay, yeah.
Well, then they're just as screwed in the head as the person who put it forward, if they are not recognizing, or they don't have within them that ability to create a line and be like, that's going a little far there.
Or they just maybe not. Some of them probably are as bad. Some of them I think aren't as bad, but they disregard their own intuitions. Because I think a lot of I've got some specific people in mind. Like they probably do read that and disagree, but then they say, "Oh well," then a different part of their brain takes over and says, "Oh well, the reason for that is," even though their initial reaction might have been, "Wait a second. Oh, but I don't have a good reason for that intuition, for that instinctive response. I need to be rational about it. And when I'm rational about it, I too can't find a good reason for disagreeing with this guy, even though I'm against pedophilia."
Is there something you wanted to say, Luke?
Yeah. I just wanted to talk a bit about this kind of thinking in philosophers and how it looks like. So for me, it's kind of like a thing that you kind of think things through completely in the abstract, right? Completely in the logical realm. And it's kind of interesting because Collingwood actually in his book, Essay on Philosophical Method, he says that a good argument in philosophy always needs to be like grounded in actual experience in every step of the way. So from your premise, to each intermediary step to your conclusion, you must always bring actual experience into it. So that's basically the antidote to these kinds of like completely off the rails arguments. And it seems to me what the left hemisphere kind of thinking does in philosophy is that people start with some premise and then they just think it through logically. And if like the most grotesque and absurd conclusion, comes from that process, they just accept it. I mean, for example, this whole materialist thing about like starting with the premise, everything is matter, life kind of evolved accidentally and all of that. And they think it through and then they come to the conclusion, oh, so there is no consciousness. It's just not, it's not there. The logic, it shows it, and there's no free will and all of that. And it's like, what? And I think the characteristic thing is this kind of strange thinking that takes place completely in the abstract and disregards or discards any like intuition and even just stopping for a moment and thinking about, I mean, what do I actually experience in this world, right? And another good example, because you mentioned Harrison Bertrand Russell. So he, at one point in his career, and some others with him, they tried to form the ideal language or come up with an ideal language because they believed, language is just not logical enough. It's just not good enough. And so that died pretty soon, this idea, but, they came up with it. And it's also very interesting to maybe kind of understand a bit better how this weird left hemisphere thinking works. Is that Collingwood, again, is as kind of the antidote to that. He said that actually what we should do is take the ambiguity of language very seriously and use it actually, for profit, to really gain a deeper understanding, to suss out like the subtleties of experience and all that. We need this kind of synonyms that have slightly different meanings and all of that. So precisely that which those guys around Russell wanted to get rid of, right? So it's kind of interesting to look for signs in this kind of thinking and maybe to find counterexamples. And we are lucky that we have philosophers like Collingwood and others who kind of understood it and offered a completely different program. But I think that's kind of like our only defense against this kind of thinking is to really understand what's going on and not accept it, basically. And but I also wanted to say it's can be dangerous, of course, too. And McGilchrist warns about that too, I think, or from the quote that you read, to just label thinkers basically like mentally ill.
Mm-hmm.
So that's. Shouldn't we should be careful, I think, to not use that, as a kind of like argument to not take anything seriously that we don't agree with or that we don't like, So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's always a danger. But then again, we should also not be bullied, into believing like absurd things. And if our gut feeling kind of tells us, I mean, that can't be right. So we shouldn't let us or have us bullied, into accepting it just because it comes with like all kinds of formal logic and complicated arguments. And that's all often how it works, right? So yeah.
And on that point, I want to bring up a couple more examples. These ones from on sexuality. But before I do, on that point, I think that bringing in the kind of, oh, that's a crazy person or that person's mentally ill, it's like that, on the one hand, that, like you said, that shouldn't be used as just a dismissive thing or just an ad hominem, because like McGilchrist says, that might even be that might even allow them to see certain things more clearly, that you wouldn't be able to see with extra baggage. So that's a point perhaps in their favor in certain regards. But also it can be used as, or I think everything should just be approached, well, it might sound cliche, but just approached scientifically. So every statement that someone makes or every argument that they make should be looked at from kind of as many angles as possible. So you can say, you take one thing that some individual says and say, okay, that looks true. All of the evidence that I have, all of the experience I have suggests that that's true. And there's good arguments for it, and et cetera, et cetera. Like on all levels, looking at it from all angles, that seems to be a true thing. But then when you come across something else, maybe it looks, maybe you intuitively do think it's true, but then the evidence shows that it's not, or maybe you have that gut reaction that says, "Oh, this can't be true," but that's a good argument. But when you tease apart different things, then maybe that's where the psychology can come in as a corrective and say, "Oh, well, that actually makes sense that he would say that for this reason." Now that will lead into these examples that I'll give. Specifically, I'll give a preview on Kant, Spinoza, Freud. Kant, Spinoza, and Freud. So Nietzsche amusingly comments, alluding to his idea of philosophy as an involuntary autobiography, that in the case of Kant, it was not even, quote, an involuntary biography of a soul, but the biography of a head, end quote. Roger Scruton points out that the great modern philosophers have tended to, quote, avoid the experience of desire as scrupulously as they have tended to avoid its analysis, end quote. He quotes Kant's description of marriage as an agreement between two people as to the reciprocal use of each other's sexual organs. He might also have quoted Spinoza on love, quote, titillation accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Ooh, a real,
real romantic.
Yeah. But he continues, but Freud's attitude to sexual desire is almost as expressive of a sort of fastidious alienation, its aim, according to him, being the, quote, union of the genitals in the act known as copulation, which leads to a release of the sexual tension and a temporary extinction of the sexual instinct, a satisfaction analogous to the sating of hunger, end quote. He described the task of psychoanalysis as drawing up the messy emotions of the patient. Quote, where id was, there shall ego be, he declared somewhat portentously. It is reclamation work, like the draining of the Zuider Zee. I don't know what the Zuider Zee is. Do you know, Luke? No? Okay. Maybe it's like some dam or something. I didn't get that reference. But he continues, perhaps Freud's biographer...
Z.
What is it?
Sea, lake, I guess, right?
Oh, the Zuider Sea. Okay. But perhaps Freud's biographer Ernest Jones could be referring to his own mentor, among others, when he suggested that philosophers are people who have been impelled to deal with various personal problems in their unconscious by making serious efforts to think consciously. They have intellectualized the emotional conflicts. The recommendation in Freud's technical papers for analysts to be emotionless, according to Ferenczi and Rank, has led to, quote, an unnatural elimination of all human factors and to a theorizing of experience. So those actually reminded me of some quotes. I can't remember if they were from The Mask of Sanity by Cleckley or his other book, A Caricature of Love, where he was talking about, I think he had some examples from famous writers, but he also had an example from a patient, or it wasn't even a patient. I think it was like a fellow professional colleague of his what was it? There were a few examples, but their description of sexuality, of sex and relationships and just humanity. And like one of them was that to picture, I think it was like advice that he gave a child or something, to just picture whenever you see another person or a woman, for instance, just realize that they're actually just like a digestive tube surrounded by skin and flesh or something. It's like that kind of just deranged view of humanity that reduces, and McGilchirst probably would have liked that quote for this book, because there's this tendency to reduce things to their parts. It's like a human isn't a human, a person. It's just a collection of parts. It's just a bunch of tubes and organs and viscera that just happen to be shaped in a certain way. And like these descriptions of marriage, it's a means of connecting the genitals to achieve a release of sexual tension. It's like there's something missing from that picture, and that's what you were talking about, Ilan, about that psychological worldview, right? An impoverished psychological worldview. There's something missing from that picture. Something pretty obvious to most people. Like I think most people would read that and be like, "All right, dude, don't know what you ate for breakfast, or don't know what planet you're from." But these are the people that, like, these are the intellectual giants that have shaped so much of the modern worldview. Now he does also have an example, a quote from Darwin, and I think McGilchirst actually has a soft spot for Darwin, because Darwin wasn't actually like this, but this is a telling quote. I'll just read part of it. This is this is a passage from his autobiography. So written near getting to the end of his life. And he's basically reflecting upon his years of thinking and scientific activity. And he starts out by saying that as a kid, he used to love poetry, and he'd read Milton, Gray, Byron, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Shakespeare. But that after years of scientific work, he can no longer read poetry. And so he writes, he finds it dull and nauseating. So he writes, "My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding laws out of a large collection of facts. And if I had to live my life again, I would have made a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week. For perhaps the parts of my brain now atrophied would thus have been kept active through use. The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness, and may possibly be injurious to the intellect, and more probably to the moral character, by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature." So Darwin actually had the self-reflectiveness, the self-awareness to see that in himself and see that it was a problem. Mm-hmm. Not everyone gets to that point. So that's a positive point for Darwin in my books, that he could at least see it and be somewhat disturbed by it. Because that is, and if it can happen to someone like Darwin, it can happen to any number of people, that there can actually be a change in a loss of function in certain human aspects, mm-hmm. that you can become a little bit more machine-like in life, given certain influences and given certain practices. But on the other hand, perhaps, hopefully, there's also the possibility for the opposite, to regain some of that function. And I don't even like, it's such a clinical word, regain that function, to become a bit more human again. Mm-hmm.
This was covered pretty well on a previous show regarding some of Matthew Ehret's writings, where he described the lives of Albert Einstein and Max Planck, and the fact that these scientific geniuses were also musicians, and pointed to their conscience and their ability to even look at world developments and comment on them with some degree of insight, mm-hmm. Precisely because they were not only scientists but human beings who were engaged in this other side of their minds. So, this flies in the face of scientism and this kind of dogmatic, hyper-rational approach to looking at information and mapping out one's own personal worldview or ideology or approach to life, that is deficient or lacking in an appreciation for those things that make us human, as you termed it before, Harrison. I agree with you guys. It isn't a constructive approach to look at the writing of a particular philosopher or great thinker and automatically dismiss them
but it can be fun
for their dryness and their their dogma. At the same time, you can see how there is this spectrum of thinking, of interacting with the world, of engaging with life and ideas that runs the gambit. So I think the more that we can see how this makes itself known in the words of a particular person, especially somebody in the public sphere who has a position of influence, the better we're able to, the better position we are to assess, where they're coming from and what we think, about the validity of their statements. And on that note, I was reminded of some press conferences with the White House recently, because we have an incredible amount of prevarication and lies and bullshit being disseminated from the White House, from spokesperson, from the Department of Justice, from the Pentagon, from Biden's representatives. And I recently saw a montage of interviews, of question answer periods that like head press corps leader Matt Lee was having with some of these individuals. And this came to the fore because Matt Lee was actually calling out, this assertion that Russia was prepared to commit a false flag in Ukraine to justify its invasion, which is part of all the rage and propaganda. In any case, there was one video I'd never seen of Matt Lee speaking to one of these representatives, someone I was not so familiar with. And he was questioning her about some assertions she was making about Ukraine and the situation there. And I have to tell you, she was really good. Her intonations, the way she twisted the facts of what was actually going on there, the way she characterized NATO as this democracy defending institution. And I thought, if I didn't know any better, if I hadn't been on the ball about the other side, the other perspective, I would say I might have been convinced by her. Mm-hmm. She was great in a kind of, pathological spellbinding sort of a way. And she spoke totally confidently. She wasn't over the top. She made these tiny little insinuations that Matt Lee, the questioning investigator, was, a little too influenced by Russian propaganda, Matt. And I thought, oh, is she good? Very presentable, and coherent. And I thought, how many other people in positions of influence, how many other individuals who are thinkers or heads of organizations have this gift of of rhetoric, of manipulation on such a high level, and yet she's an effing liar. Yeah, so we're in a lot of trouble.
Yes, that gets back to our show on the managerial revolution, because that is it's the standard operating procedure. It's the modus operandi of, the managerial class. But that actually leads me to this book. I want to talk about this book maybe a bit today, but get to it into the future too. The Machiavellians, Defenders of Freedom by James Burnham. I was inspired to read this by Michael McConkie, whose book on the managerial class we discussed on a previous episode, because he wrote something recently. Well, first of all, I want to do a little test. So I want to ask all of you your thoughts on Machiavelli. Even if you don't know anything about him, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about Machiavelli? We'll start with Luke.
Prince.
The prince, yes. Yes, okay. Anything else, or just the prince?
No, I mean, what comes to mind, what is kind of like ingrained is like evil tyranny and how to exploit people.
Okay. Any dissenting views or agreement from the other members of our panel?
Yeah, I mean, the dark triad includes, the idea of this manipulation, Machiavellianism.
That's that's always been my initial reaction until McConkie's, until reading McConkie's Substack, where he introduces the Italian realist school, and then you're like, oh, well, maybe it's not pure evil.
Yeah.
Like maybe there's some points to it that are actually like, you kind of have to do some of this stuff just by virtue of the fact of what you're trying to do.
Well, also, okay, good stuff. I want to just read a couple things from this book. Well, first of all, Burnham, I believe, I haven't read too much about him, but from what I think I remember about him, he, like, at one point he was a Trotskyist. So he was a commie, and then he got disillusioned with all that, and then he got disillusioned with all ideologies. And then he wrote the book in like 1941, I think, The Managerial Revolution, which is kind of one of the foundations for that thing. And so on the first page of this book, the epitaph, or what do you call that thing at the beginning of the book? A quotation. It's a quote from Machiavelli. This was a letter to Buondelmonte. What's his name? Zenobi Buondelmonte, one of his kind of noble friends. And this was from a letter to him. I verified the quote. You can find it on Google Books. So I come now to the last branch of my charge, that I teach princes villainy and how to enslave. If any man will read over my book with impartiality and ordinary charity, he will easily perceive that it is not my intention to recommend that government or those men there described to the world, much less to teach men how to trample upon good men, and that all that is sacred and venerable upon earth, laws, religion, honesty, and whatnot. If I have been a little too punctual in describing these monsters in all their lineaments and colors, I hope mankind will know them, the better to avoid them, my treatise being both a satire against them and a true character of them. So some might say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because he says that doesn't mean that's not what he was doing. But Burnham makes a pretty good case that Machiavelli, when you actually read his writings, all his writings, which I haven't done, but maybe I will eventually, that he was actually a Republican. Like, he believed that a republic was the best form of government, like not an absolute monarchy, for instance, but that Burnham argues, like a political scientist, one of the first political scientists, who was trying to look at the way things actually work. So what the Prince was what Burnham argues, essentially a description of the way politics works, and not an endorsement necessarily of that politics, but with now there might be a kind of a little bit of autism there, I don't know, but in the sense of, oh, well, here's the things that work, so do that. But from reading Burnham, I'm not even sure I'd go that far. I think, but I'll reserve judgment until I actually read more Machiavelli myself. But what do I want to say about that? So, for instance, Burnham responds to the charge that Machiavelli himself has a dim view of human nature. that humans are these lowly kind of like thieving, like betraying, like people, and that's just the way the world is. But Burnham argues that actually, like Machiavelli in his writings, doesn't actually have a view of human nature. He is, in the same way that Adam Smith was describing economic man as a description of man in one capacity in a certain situation, which is in Smith's case economics, that Machiavelli is describing political man. Now, naturally, if you have an idea of what politics is, it's not going to be a pretty picture. So what do you expect him to write? That's the defense, at least. Now, I want to read one other quote from Burnham on Machiavelli. So this is in the last chapter in the section on Machiavelli here, because this book covers several political theorists like Machiavelli, Mosca, Sorels, and Pareto. So he writes in this last chapter on on Machiavelli's reputation. He points out, what do I want to read here? Okay. In any case, whatever may be the desires of most men, it is most certainly against the interests of the powerful that the truth should be known about political behavior. If the political truths stated or approximated by Machiavelli were widely known by men, the success of tyranny and all other forms of oppressive political rule would become much less likely. A deeper freedom would be possible in society than Machiavelli himself believed attainable. If men generally understood as much of the mechanism of rule and privilege as Machiavelli understood, they would no longer be deceived into accepting that rule and privilege, and they would know what steps to take to overcome them. Therefore, the powerful and their spokesmen, all the official thinkers, the lawyers and philosophers and preachers and demagogues and moralists and editors, must defame Machiavelli. Machiavelli says that rulers lie and break faith. This proves, they say, that he libels human nature. Machiavelli says that ambitious men struggle for power. He is apologizing for the opposition, the enemy, and trying to confuse you about us, who wish to lead you for your own good and welfare. Machiavelli says that you must keep strict watch over officials and subordinate them to the law. He is encouraging subversion and the loss of national unity. Machiavelli says that no man with power is to be trusted. You see that his aim is to smash all your faith and ideals. Small wonder that the powerful, in public, denounce Machiavelli. The powerful have long practice and much skill in sizing up their opponents. They can recognize an enemy who will never compromise, even when that enemy is so abstract as a body of ideas. So, so I want to get into a bit more Machiavelli, because when you read I've only read excerpts from The Prince, but when you read them out of context, or as I have, that's the impression you get, that Machiavelli essentially had this schizoidal worldview that human nature is so bad that you need a strong power in order to control them.
But he's really only talking about a subset of people in society. The political class.
And his views are actually more nuanced than that, because he does say something like that. He does have those statements about what humans are like. But then he also has other statements where he says that, a lot of humans are like this. Well, here are some human flaws. But he also he doesn't limit his view of human nature, if he even expresses one, to that. He does talk about the good and the bad in humans, and that the bad just tend to be the features that are most often, that you see more often in politics. I think he says that, or something to that degree, that as bad as human nature can be, you find the worst of it in the princes, in politics. And Burnham says that, unlike Dante, well, he's got a great comparison between Dante, who wrote a book called De Monarchia, and Machiavelli. Well, we'll save that for another show. But he points out that Machiavelli's political aim was the unification of Italy at this time, and so he was actually a historian, like a fairly good historian for what he could do at the time, like reading the classics and trying to look at the classics and look at recent history and to figure out the like political laws, like, when this happens, or so one conclusion might be that a leader needs the support of his own population in warfare, for instance. That you can't hire mercenaries and you can't hire foreign armies because they won't have loyalty, and like you need the loyalty of your actual citizens. And so then he gives examples. So he's kind of looking for what works and what doesn't work. So with his political goal in mind, it's the unification of Italy. He says, well, this is what's going to work. I'm a Republican, but it looks like we might need a monarch in order to unify Italy. And so that was his policy recommendation in like kind of a realist school. Well, I prefer this form of government, but I don't think it's going to work in this case for this goal. So in that sense,
it's pragmatic and real.
Yeah. But I don't know. What do you have any thoughts, guys? Luke, are you going to be? Are you going to become a Machiavellian now?
Yeah. Let's go all out here to achieve our goal. No, I was just thinking about what we talked about earlier with this kind of schizoidal thinking or left hemisphere thinking, and I guess I preferred someone like Machiavelli, who at least seems to give a shot at telling us how it is, or just being realistic about what politics is. What most of us have probably heard about in school, and what you usually learn about political theory is like Hobbes and Locke, and these ideas that, to me at least, seem pretty much on the left hemisphere side of things, right? Because they proclaim, a totally fictitious natural state, that never existed, and it's just a figment of the imagination, an abstraction, basically, and then deduce, like logically from there, how a society should be, which or justifies the society that we're living in. And it's it has been widely criticized, this kind of approach, and rightfully so, because it seems to me like one of these instances where abstract thinking just goes wrong, where you just take some random facts and then create a huge abstraction, from it, like the societal contract, and things like that just, everyone who just, as Collingwood recommends, goes back to actual experience, will think, what contract, what is this nonsense? People, that's not our experience, how society works, right? And it's all these theoretical stuff. And so in that regard, I find it interesting what you mentioned about Machiavelli. I just heard bits and pieces about him here and there too, so I have never read his work except for maybe a few excerpts. But it strikes me as interesting to see. To ask yourself, why was he so demonized when he actually was at least trying to give us like an unfiltered account of the real madness that is going on in politics, as opposed to some these weird, abstract theories.
I think you just said it right there, Lucien. I think it's quite possible that he was so insightful and so unabashed about stating things as they actually work, that this kind of veneer of, well, why would you want to read about Machiavellianism? Why would you want to think in a manipulative manner? Why would you even want to learn how to, as though this was an instruction manual in manipulative thinking, which it doesn't appear to be. And I don't remember the exact circumstances, but I think he was politically persecuted at some point, and even kind of excommunicated or told to leave the city from which he lived. That may be neither here nor there, but it would be interesting at some point to look at all of the, or at least some of the the great thinkers and writings and texts of the past few hundred years to see who else may be mischaracterized and stereotyped.
Julius Caesar.
I took the words right out of my mouth. You read about the works of Julius Caesar, even JFK, and they had to pull certain political strings and behave, in a Machiavellian manner, precisely because of the environment and the milieu in which they were in. They couldn't come from on high and try and implement good policies without also thinking about how the opposition would be moving against them and what the opposition wanted. So, there might be this kind of idealistic, fantasy about how politics actually works that is so far from the way things really are that many people have been led to believe and have faith in, that Machiavelli saw through. And, what's another word for it? Realpolitik.
Mm-hmm.
This is how politics really works. So, sounds like an interesting book.
Well, who was it that said something about people don't like the ideological striptease?
Lobaczewski.
That was Lobaczewski?
Yeah.
Because that's immediately what came to my mind is, Lucian, you were talking about how, he had this, how Machiavelli had this, way of presenting things that, and you mentioned it as well, Alon, how he had this way of presenting things laid bare as they are without all of the glitz and the glamour. It's like you were reading, Harrison, about the accusations against, why would you read Machiavelli? He's just inciting violence against your benevolent leaders.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, it takes that and it strips it of all of its gloss and all of its glitz and all of its, highfalutin supposed ideals and lays bare that which is really true about it, which is ugly and gross and but real nonetheless.
Yeah, Burnham says that he defines politics as the struggle for power, and that's pretty much what he limits it to. It's like politics is the struggle of power, and if you don't understand that, then you're going to be deceived by all the appearances on top of that. And so Burnham starts out the book by quoting the 1932 platform of the Democratic Party in the United States and all of their ideals and the things they want and how they're going to save money and eliminate unnecessary government like divisions and administrative like centers and committees and trim down the government and do all this stuff. And then he says, how does he put it?
And then in reality.
Yeah. Then he says, essentially like, okay, we've just read that. Now, how can we make sense that it seems like it was so, like those ideals were so clear, such a clear policy position. How can we explain the fact that they did literally nothing of that sort? And it's like, well, it's because that's the nature of politics, is that politics isn't about doing things for the public good or any of the policy positions that political parties give. If they achieve any of those might be like how to put it, like unintended effects, or they might be done, but it's because they have to be done in the context of the pursuit of political power. If they can get away with not doing them, then they're going to not do them. And that's where the managerial class kind of comes into play. Is that the feature of the managerial class is that ability with language, essentially to lie, to be a PR man. And that's where you look at the history of public relations and propaganda. It's so prevalent everywhere in politics and in mainstream culture and in modern culture that that it is this functional psychopathy where it is just, it's seen as completely normal to just tell bald-faced lies. And I think a lot of people probably realize it, but it's kept under the surface. It's not too frequently acknowledged. Like, you won't see Matt Lee or any of, like, Matt Lee, who you brought up, Ilan, and like a lot of these like good reporters, they know that, but they'll never say it. They'll never say, I know you're just a PR person. I know you're just giving me the line. I know you're lying to me right now. Can we have the real deal? No, they play the game. Like, they take them at their word. Like, okay, we'll pretend that you're being as honest as possible, but you're not. You're actually just lying, and that's the mentality. That's the corporate mentality. That's the political reality. Is that you tell people what they want to hear. Oh, we've got this internal scandal. Let's draft a statement where we present ourselves in the best light possible, even though everyone knows it's just like a shitty PR statement that has very little relation to reality. It's just the image we want to present ourselves, the image of ourselves that we want to present to the world, and it's just all bullshit. And well, yeah, there's a reason for that. I wanted to read one more little thing from Burnham on Machiavelli on this well, I don't know if it's on this subject. There was a quote on where he talks about, politics as the struggle for power and kind of some of the implications of that, but I don't have the quote handy, so I won't read that one, but I will read this. Burnham writes, the ruled majority, he's kind of paraphrasing Machiavelli's outlook. The ruled majority, changeable, weak, short-sighted, selfish, is not at all for Machiavelli the black to the ruler's white. Indeed, for him, the ruler type is even less constant, less loyal, and on many occasions, less intelligent. And then he's got some quotes. Let me see if this one's okay. I say that this is Machiavelli writing. I say then, in behalf of the multitude, that when they are charged withal by most authors, may be charged that what they are charged withal by most authors may be charged upon all private persons in the world, and especially upon princes. For whoever lies irregularly and is not restrained by the law is subject to the same exorbitancies, and will commit as bad faults as the most dissolute multitude in the world. And this may be easily known, if it be considered how many princes there have been, and how few of them good. He wrote that in Discourses. So his Discourses on Livy, which, as far as I know, is kind of like a better representation of what what Machiavelli's own thoughts on government should be. So that's where you see a lot of his republicanism come out, in kind of as a contrast to the limits that he places on himself in The Prince. But yeah, I mean, who knows? I might become a Machiavellian, but but in the sense that we can still use the word Machiavellian, because Machiavellianism, like you mentioned, Ilan, is the word that we use for like a feature of kind of like the psychopathic personality in the dark triad, like Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy. It's a certain type of like manipulative personality type, and that is the personality type that Machiavelli describes. It's not necessarily the one that he proscribes, the one that he recommends, but it's the one that you see in politics. So the argument could be made that Machiavelli was like an early, he was the first to lay bare that personality, the Machiavellian personality, and perhaps it's just unfortunate that it has his name and people now associate him personally with a Machiavellian personality when he may have just been essentially saying that's just the way it is. That's what these people are like. Mm. So some thoughts. We'll get into that in the future. Do we want to wrap it up? Do you have any final thoughts, Luke? Any insights on what we've been talking about?
No, maybe just to reiterate what I kept thinking, when you talked about lying politicians and all of that. One of the tricks that they seem to take advantage of is, again, this kind of like hyper rational deductive kind of thinking, where you start with a premise. For example, our leaders want to figure out the best for us, something like that, and then you logically form an argument out of that, and in people's mind that kind of works, right? So if everything that is deduced from this premise, with all these kinds of arguments, that kind of make sense. But if you once just stop and look at your own experience, for example, in like organizations or even on a small scale, right? Just have this kind of feedback, when you hear people, coming up with grand theories and justifications and all of that. Just think about the experience on the ground, even in your own life, even if you don't work for governments, but everyone, I guess, has experience with organizations. So I think that's a good way of kind of grounding our experience and filtering out and catching at least some of those preposterous lies about how the world actually works.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all. I think that's a good note to end it on. We'll be back. Like I said, I want to talk about this book some more, so maybe I'll get you guys to read it with me, because it's pretty cool. I'm particularly interested in getting to the modern Machiavellians. So the guys I mentioned, Mosca, Sorrels, Pareto, more modern. Like, they were all around the time of the First World War when they did their writings. And so I'll be interested to see what they have to say too. And yeah, we'll be talking about more Ponerology. Maybe we'll be talking about some schizoids some more in the future, because there's a lot more to say. But with that, we'll leave it there, and make sure, if you enjoyed this conversation, to hit the subscribe button. If there's a like button, how do these things work? Is there a like button? Hit the like button, and hit that notification button too, if you want to be notified that we're back next week. We enjoy having readers, listeners, viewers. So leave a comment too. We like comments most of the time. Sometimes we even reply to them. So enjoy. Thank you. Take care. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye, everyone.